Welcome back, everyone, to Season 2, Episode 4 of the FPL Script for the 23-24 FPL season. This is our Game Week 3 review. I am your co-host, Fran, otherwise known as FPL Fran on other platforms, with my co-host, JD, or Schadenfreudist, on other platforms as well. Of course, Game Week 2 was a rather poor week for us non-Salah owners, and particularly non-Salah cappers, as our source of points were very minimal. And that was pretty much the state of my game week, particularly since I owned a certain Arsenal midfielder that wasn't named Martin Odegaard. And yeah, Havertz pretty much was the only savior of my game week, given his low ownership, and ultimately he failed quite severely. Even got less points than Martinelli, despite getting around 30 more minutes of football. And then really, Mbumo was the only one who, as I said, got me points this week, and Pedro, of course, João Pedro, who did well in Game Week 1. So in retrospect, I would say a bit of a reversion to what he was expected to have, let's say around 58, 60 mins over the course of Game Weeks 1 to 3. Right now, by the time of Game Week 2, at the end of that, he's probably clocked in around 120 minutes himself. So still seemingly an okay pick, but the expectations for him have vastly sort of changed from initially being fantastic to, I would say, amongst the pack of forwards right now.
Yeah, I think that's quite a reasonable take, and it's helped temper expectations for Joao Pedro owners as well as non-owners. I think who are looking to quickly jump on that train and who may be now rethinking their strategy. For me, I had a good week, I guess, because I have a green arrow. As you said, Mbuemo is an absolute legend, and I didn't own Joe Pedro. I owned Watkins, who again got an assist. I had two penalty takers in my team this week who are no longer the penalty takers for their team. So I suppose in the long run, that's not a great week to have, and I might be looking to move Watkins on in game week 4 now that that's the case. And we've also seen that Unai Emery is giving certain priority to European games as well. So all in all, looks like there will be a couple of changes on the card soon.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think one thing that our teams both had, of course, was the fortune and luck of being able to move from Gabriel to Saliba. Of course,
Yeah.
another thing that where if you look sort of at Chase's Twitter post around a week back when we discussed this the first time round, yeah, extremely important, unfortunately, to be around and to get that information around the deadline. That's sort of the name of the game. But let's just move quickly forward from that because we did touch on that last week. So this week is actually quite interesting because I feel like a lot of pairs have suddenly become quite interesting in the attacking positions from three teams: City, Chelsea, and Spurs. A lot of us have already gone into some of these picks, particularly, let's say, Jackson from Chelsea and Richarlison as well from Spurs, especially if you, let's say, take a bit of an analytic approach, because I understand some people already have Madison, but in reality, these are the picks that I think are quite popular. However, with the KDB injury and now us sort of staring down Sheffield United away, let's just start with City. I think Alvarez and Foden have probably been creeping him up amongst a lot of solves. Maybe Foden not so much because Grealish's X-Mens are very, very high. I think if I was to start there, I think Luke made a good point, particularly on Discord as well, just talking about how arguably the Grealish left wing X-Mens aren't particularly high. If you look at, for example, what happened when when KDB was injured, you saw Alvarez moving towards the left wing position. Even Foden could play on the left at times. So maybe his X-Mens are quite high, but in general, you've got that slot now. At least even as a Game Week 4 transfer with Foden coming in. And then Alvarez, I'm sure for a lot of João Pedro owners, might be an option as opposed to just simply Jackson, which I think a lot of people were eyeing up as soon as Game Week 1 started, if they were a João Pedro owner themselves.
Yes, with the Alvarez thing, for example, review is now recommending a Watkins to Alvarez move for me in game week 4 with the default X means, and we can take that call. I think closer to game week 4, for example, if people want to move for Alvarez then. But if you want to move for Alvarez in game week 3, I don't have an argument against it, to be honest, because right now his minutes look more secure than ever. I don't know. I know Jeremy Doku has probably already signed for City, and we'll soon get confirmation of that. But I don't know how he's going to fit in. And as we've seen every season, the new signing always gets less minutes to begin with, and then they slowly build up. And their second season is probably the season where they are most effective, or they are more effective than their first season. So given that, and also given that Alvarez moved to City last season, which means that this is his second season, all of those things point to the fact that maybe his X minutes should be more than what they are on review currently. And if we were to bump up his X minutes, it would mean that he is almost an automatic reserve spot in our teams, because the City attack, the biggest problem with attack that we've always had is a lack of guaranteed X mins. And if Alvarez were to give us that, then I think it's quite a no-brainer. And with Foden, I think it's a similar thing, because Luke, going off of Luke's point, if we think that Grealish this season no longer has monopoly on the left wing position like he did in the second half of last season, then that means that it opens up a lot more avenues for Foden to play. For example, even if, let's say, Bernardo Silva, because he's getting on in age and he might play less games than he has been playing with the intensity that he plays with, you might also see maybe Foden play in midfield. I know he hasn't played that role for a lot of minutes, but who knows? It's Pep, and he can definitely change some tactics and fit Foden in, and we could ultimately see Foden getting a lot more minutes that he always has throughout the season. So I don't know about you, but I'm planning on waiting for one more week just to get more information, and also because two free transfers are better than one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think going Alvarez is probably only for those who are on someone like João Pedro, just
Yeah.
because the transfer seems to line up. But anyways, I would say if we move on to Chelsea, Sterling has become the option that seems quite interesting this week, just because we have a couple conundrums with the Arsenal midfielders. And if you, let's say, have some other mids, like let's say Richarlison, you might even be thinking of moving away now that his X-Mins aren't as perfect as we sort of initially assumed. And also Sterling's baselines seem really, really good. So running some souls with him and with good mins, given that Chelsea have a plethora of injuries, like Nkunku out, Chukwuemeka out as well, although I'm not exactly sure he's out for as long as he's been rumored to be. Ultimately, still there's more than capacity for Sterling to be an 85 X-Mins player for really the next few weeks, which is crucial.
Yeah, and we can see that if you bump up Sterling's minutes, he clearly is a good FPL asset, as he always has been throughout the years. For our sakes, again, it's always good that players are on penalties, but with Sterling, you hope that he stays away from them, given that his record is quite poor compared to what other FPL assets have put up over the years. So, if we want to look at Sterling instead of Jackson, for example, I myself am looking towards that, because if I were to move Havertz on, I only have one free transfer, so I cannot do both Watkins to Jackson, for example, and Havertz to Sterling. So if I were to do just one, I would probably do Havertz to Sterling. Also because I'm quite frustrated from today's game, so maybe today is not the right right day to make this decision. I might just wait till tomorrow to see how I feel about it. But as of today, if I were to do that one transfer, I would definitely do Havertz to Sterling as that transfer, given that Chelsea have such a good run of games from game week 3 onwards.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I do think Jackson and Watkins are the only true safe bets in the forward positions because
Yeah.
if you are someone who does like just simply getting some good X-Men's options that are most likely nailed, these are probably your two best bets. And the issue, of course, with a lot of us, I think, is we do have maybe two spots reserved for Chelsea defenders, which means you're only picking one of Jackson and Sterling. And because we have so many more options in the midfield, maybe Sterling is someone that you can pass on for the time being, which is nice because I think when we move on to our next point, it's not really a combination of midfielders and forwards, but in Spurs, you've got Richarlison and Madison, who are both midfielder picks. And maybe if we get, let's say, information over penalties, even Son becomes a viable pick potentially. So ultimately, because I think there's so many mids, Jackson is someone who's much more enticing to me. And yeah, I would probably think about Sterling for game week 4 as someone who actually owns Havertz as well and probably needs to do something about owning Havertz by game week 4 as well.
Yeah, just on the point of Jackson, owners have been massively unlucky, there's no doubt. But also, if there is any game week that you would want to get onto an asset like Jackson, it would be game week 3. If you believe in that sort of narrative that 1.4 xg with zero goals will come home to roost in game week 3, but even if it doesn't, it is a good enough indication that he is a striker that is going to get a lot of chances, which translates to high xg, which translates to probably some goals at least, if not many. Once Nkuku is back, we might see a reduction of his minutes as well. And we can, on this point, we can move on to the next topic, which is Arsenal for Game Week 3. So we have a number of things to talk about here, starting off with Arteta's press conference, where we found out two important things. The first one being that he has outright said that Gabriel is going to play many games this season, and that his move to the Saudi League is probably not going to happen based on what he has said today. And you noted something interesting about what he had to say about the penalty as well.
Yeah, I mean, he effectively said that he didn't know what was going to happen with the penalty situation and that it was a decision made by the players. Now, of course, reading into this, you'd probably think if Odegaard scores this penalty, why wouldn't he take subsequent penalties? And I'd probably agree with that argument, but you could say that maybe it ultimately could still come down to Saka's decision in the future. I suppose if he wants to continue taking penalties or not. Either way, I think, of course, you can already see on review, on any sort of horizon, really, that Odegaard has become the clear Arsenal default mid option. And it suggests that, of course, there's a lot left on the table if you didn't go with Odegaard, particularly that sort of JP plus Odegaard pairing. Those sorts of owners now are very clearly running away with it from an EV point of view. But it sort of reminds me of the situation last season when we were looking at these kind of constant swaps between these Arsenal midfielders, between Martinez, Odegaard, and then back again, and that not really working out. I just feel like they're all such great picks, and you're sort of targeting the same run of fixtures. It feels really bad sometimes, particularly when at the early point in the season when you need a bit more information, you might be moving between certain assets to actually move on from one club player to another when the X-Mens are still quite good. So the only thing I would say with Saka and Odegaard is I think it's probably going to show up as quite a popular move for a lot of people, particularly because Game Week 2 or Game Week 3 rather, if you don't have any kind of pressing concerns, like let's say owning James, owning Stones, owning Gabriel, who actually seems rather good now because of the Tomiyasu yellow, which we'll get onto in a second. But this sort of situation, it feels like if you have two free transfers, you could make this move, but I would definitely pass up on it.
No, that's an interesting point when it comes to swapping assets from the same club, especially in the same position, because as you said, for us it didn't work out last season when we went from Martinelli to Odegaard. And Odegaard and Saka essentially, when if they swap penalty taking duties, I think their EV essentially is swapped. So Odegaard then becomes the clear favorite pick. And then I have to question the need to own Saka as well, if that is the case. So maybe down the line you can do Saka to Odegaard as well directly instead of now going for someone like, for us example, going from Kai Havertz to Odegaard, because the next game against Fulham is the same game for all three players. So might as well bet on a certain outcome and then stick with it for one game week, given that free transfers are valuable always. And also to your point about the EV, I don't think it's going to matter too much about the EV. I think they've rather run away with the XG rank when it comes to Joao Pedro plus Odegaard, because both of them scored a penalty. So that's a really good XG for them. But because Odegaard's minutes were less than Havertz, I think we've won on the MD rank game already as Havertz owners, which is the only victory we can claim, because otherwise it's been quite grim as far as Havertz is concerned. And finally, I think the last point here is, rather not a point, but just to conclude, Gabriel, finally, do we expect him to start then next week?
Yeah, I think so. But just to clarify on the Odegaard point, I was just more talking about future EV.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, yeah,
In
makes
terms
sense.
of Gabriel, with the Tomiyasu yellow, I think Gabriel will definitely start next week just because they don't have any other options to sort of play in the setups that they have available. It was interesting to see the team sort of play with both Zinchenko and Partey again. But yeah, I think we'll probably go back to a structure where you're seeing something which we saw last season with Arsenal. I suppose it might have some impacts on where Havertz would play. If let's say Zinchenko was to join back into the team, would we see
Hmm.
Rice and Partey play again in the midfield? And what does that sort of really mean with Havertz, who's somewhat nailed down 96 minutes and two games with Arsenal? That's an interesting thing to think about because, of course, Havertz sort of was filling multiple roles because of the yellow card as well. So very similar to last week, where when he was moving to strike or even the 10 position, you could argue when, let's say, Nketiah was subbed off. Here he was getting to play as a 9 again, but, just a very defensive 9, just given the game state. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on actually how that impacts Havertz, because I do think Gabriel, for the time being, is nailed.
Yeah, I have no idea. Firstly, because from last season we've seen so many changes in how Arsenal play this season, and I've seen a lot of Arsenal fans complain about that because it's a distinct change from how they were set up last season, especially with the whole Partey's not being a part of the midfield role, where he's playing a more hybrid role this season. So if we were to take that into account, I certainly think that if Partey were to move back into midfield, it's debatable as to if Havertz is going to start every week. I understand that Nketiah has already performed quite well and he is meeting perhaps Arteta's expectations, but we never know how that will change. And then if that means that Havertz has to start as a number 9, well, we might luck out. But I think both of us are going to go out of Havertz in game week 3, so we better pray that that doesn't happen after game week 3.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll probably keep Havertz because he seemingly fits a variety of roles, and the minutes are still good, and I think that's enough on Arsenal. And by the way, so just to clarify a point on me saying Gabriel is nailed, I just meant really for game week 3,
Yeah, yeah.
because and also because Zinchenko's back into the team, probably likely that Arteta could start playing with that formation for a bit. Maybe Tomiyasu finds his way back into the team immediately by game week 5, but we can probably assess then. And if you're a Gabriel owner, I'd definitely play him still in game week 3 because it's hard to see him actually missing out in that game now. Just generally, I think on that sort of Gabriel topic, I'm sure some people would be still interested in taking him out, maybe for reasons of rage. And also, you've got some issues such as James and such as Diaz, which some people might not have been able to address before the game week 2 deadline, but do have to address now. And sorry, not Diaz, but rather Stones, who's out for game weeks 3 and 4, confirmed by Pep's sort of timeline. Although, whether we trust that or not is another point. But Stones is naturally, of course, someone who's quite injury prone too. We have Diaz back, which I think is probably the most logical answer to any sort of transfer out situation in the defender situation, because a City defender, if you don't already, let's say, have a triple up of City, is probably the best way to go. They've already started the season impeccably, I would say. The amount of control they have with the sort of 4 defenders that they have right now, even with Stones out, is quite insane. This is a Newcastle team who we respect a lot from an offensive point of view, completely shut out in that game for the most part. And yeah, I think Diaz is a very simple transfer, but at the same time, we also need to probably redistribute funds in the midfield and the forward position. So who would you sort of look at for budget options?
Yeah, between you and I think we've identified a couple of good options for replacements when it comes to Stones or James. We can look at Udogi, who plays Bournemouth in game week 3, or we have Malo Gusto, who is playing Luton in game week 3, or again, we have Botman. You can plan for the future by getting him in right now and bench him for game weeks 3 and 4 so that he's ready to start by game week 5. The only danger with a move like that is an injury. If he gets injured in game weeks 3 or 4, then that's another transfer that is down the drain and you have to transfer him out again. So if you want immediate impact for your team, I think Udogi and Gusto are the two options. And if you want to look at maybe a slightly higher price bracket, you can look at someone like Diaz, as you said. He is the most nailed City defender. I don't think there are any doubts about that. And the other pick that we've been talking about is Akanji. Because contrary to many on Twitter, I don't think Guardiola is as nailed as people think. But I think Akanji is more to that effect. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I saw one of Luke's initial predicted lineups, and it sort of had Guardiola as if he could play the Stones position, but on the left hand side.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but I think he's not even that sure about, let's say, Guardiola's ability to sort of fulfill that role immediately. We've already
Hmm.
seen Akanji play that in the Super Cup, although it wasn't pretty, I would say. At the same time, hard to sort of take away from that game because it's one game. You probably could have watched that game and said Foden was terrible, and he then plays an actual serious game, I would say, versus Newcastle and completely blows away
Yeah.
everyone there. So yeah, I think Akanji right now can play a variety of roles, even on both hand sides of the defense, which is probably the scariest part. Because I remember even as a Real Madrid fan watching him play the left center back role, and he can do that too. So The positional flexibility is really nice, where with Guardiola and Ake, you're probably still looking at roles on the left, and that's already quite restrictive. Akanji and Walker sort of benefit now with Stones being out. So I would say Akanji is the only option that I would move towards if I, for some reason, wanted to, let's say, save a little bit of money over Diaz. And going back to the 4.5 defenders, I think what's interesting is Botman makes sense if you have complete coverage somehow of game weeks 3 and 4. But 4 is going to be a very tricky week for all managers because we all presumably own one Arsenal defender, maybe even own Shaw or another United defender. And so that's already two players with a generally bad fixture. I know now Estupinian is creeping into territories where some managers are thinking they have to start him every single week, and potentially I might be falling prey to this trap in Game Week 3. But yes, this is an issue in Game Week 4, and that's why I think Udogi and Gusto are appearing as much more popular options in Souls right now, just because you really need that coverage, and maybe the EV gap is quite significant in Game Week 4, so you have to sort of push towards a defender who has a good game on that fixture.
Yeah, to the Udogi point, I don't know how much weightage you are assigning to the fact that he got subbed pretty early into the United game. I suspect it has more to do with getting more control in defense for the team. So that's why I think Ben Davies came on for him in that game. And if that's a game state thing, then I think we can just ignore that. But that's one to keep an eye on for game week 3. I still think he's a good pick regardless. But I think Gusto right now, at least in the short term, has the most secure minutes that I can think of. Because if Pochettino wants to keep playing this system where Chilwell is essentially left wing and then Gusto maybe tucks in sometimes, but then sometimes is also attacking. Then in that system, I don't think Dizazi is going to fit in that system. If he wants to change systems, he can obviously, and maybe that 3-1 hammering is going to change his mind. Pun unintended, but at the same time, both defenders have an equal say, I think, in terms of who we want to transfer into our teams. Do you have a preference with either of those?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't. I mean, I've gone for Gusto already because I was fearful
Oh wow!
of a
Yeah.
James
Okay.
price fall previously, but that was mostly
Okay.
because I started with a much deeper bench than most. So James was already
Mm.
kind of my fourth defender in FPL, or even you can argue fifth. So that's why I was comfortable making a move towards Gusto, because I was sort of eyeing up maybe going 4-5-1 for a bit, and I still have the option to do that by going for Gusto in the short term. So that's sort of why I've gone for Gusto. And as you said with the Udogi thing, I think there was a press conference early in the season where Angie was talking about Ben Davies and how he sees him more as a left back than a center back. So
Mhm.
unsurprising that he kind of comes on for Udogi. Maybe unlikely that he'll continue to take that many minutes from Udogi, but
Mhm.
from Spurs fans, I think an X-Men's of something like 68 to 75 is probably already safe.
Yes.
But anything beyond that, I think you're probably reaching, if we're being honest. And so that sort of brings us to a close in terms of macro topics for Game Week 3. Is there anything you want to add before we sort of touch on my specific, niche topic?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
this
this
topic
topic
is
is
really
really
interesting,
interesting,
and I
and I
want to
want to
get
get
into
into
this
this
because
because
I
I
don't
don't
suspect a
suspect a
lot
lot
of
of
people
people
are
are
thinking
thinking
about
about
this.
this,
But
but
Bench
bench
Boost
boost
Game
Game
Week
Week
3,
3.
talk to
Talk to
me
me
about
about
how
how
you
you
got
got
here
here
and
and
why
why
are
are
you
you
thinking
thinking
about
about
employing
employing
Bench
bench
Boost
boost
so
so
early
early
in
in
the
the
season.
season? Yeah, so I mean from speaking to managers who probably know better than myself in terms of also just looking at studies of chips and so forth. I think yes, on one hand, when we saw last season with the sort of very loose pricing, you could argue that it makes sense to save your bench boost later on when you have a much more stronger team, when you have much more team value. But I would still say that maybe the axiom that some people hold that a bench boost is worth 15 points is sort of what I'm gunning for here with a potential bench boost here. I'm not saying I'm locking it in. I'm not telling people to do it, but it's just a unique situation that I find myself in because I sort of created a 4-5-1 draft with João Pedro, and ultimately I only have a 4.5 that I really need to replace in order to actually play a good bench boost 3. Turner obviously has a horrific fixture versus United, but the rest of the bench really makes up for it, and it's around 15 plus EV anyways. It would be Saliba, Estupinian, and João Pedro. And so that already brings me to that 15 EV threshold. And when I was sort of initially looking at bench boost 3 earlier in the week before it was sort of well maybe it died its first death, I suppose, due to the João Pedro benching. I was actually looking at solves and seeing that it was sort of destroying my long term EV, right? So on an 8 game week horizon, that 15 points that I was getting from the bench boosting in game week 3 was starting to slip away. And I think now with sort of the rise of Alvarez as a pick and the benefit of the flexibility with, let's say, Gusto as well, giving me a lot more budget and also just generally the ability to sort of ignore him as a 4.0 option, I'm not I'm no longer losing that EV as long as Enciso's out, and or let's say he's not fit to start for Game Week 3. So if João Pedro's a starter, even let's say giving him 60 X mins, the bench boost works really well for me just in terms of getting more than 15 EV. I think it's something like 16 EV from the bench boost as it stands. Obviously, numbers will change, but going forwards, actually, I don't really lose any long term value. And previous, as I said, in future game weeks, I was actually losing my eval score as well and my MD. But actually, with the sort of rotation with both Alvarez and João Pedro, which I think is going to be very risky and very hard to deal with, but because I have such great defenders, I'm not too worried ultimately, and my midfield is very strong. I'm not losing actually any of that EV until let's say game week 10, just looking at an 8 game week horizon. So I'm quite confident that it will be the play that I execute if we get that sort of really positive NCSO news. And then worst case, if it doesn't happen, I'm just going to be rolling my other free transfer. So that's what's going to happen for me this week.
Now, and just to entice you towards bench boost a bit more, if you were to, for example, put in a review that you're playing your wildcard in 9, I'm pretty sure it will even boost your EV further, because that means that you are only going to be carrying the heavy bench. It's not even that heavy, but heavy for the purposes of EV for a couple of weeks. It's not like you're going to be carrying it for, let's say, up to game week 16 or something, if you were to play your wildcard in game week 9. So, all in all, I think it's a refreshing idea. I think it's not as novel as Bench Boost Game Week 1, but it's right up there. And you heard it here, folks. He's going to play it if Joao Pedro is locked. That's the only thing holding him back. So as long as Joao Pedro starts, we are good to go for Bench Boost Game Week 3.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. But
Okay, moving on to the final topic of our pod today, which is, of course, captaincy. This week, I think Holland is clear. Both of us are captaining Holland, and that's the end of this discussion, isn't
yeah, it is. I
it?
mean, your secondary options are probably 0.5, 0.6 EV away from Holland. It's a perfect Holland fixture. It's Sheffield United away. It could only be better if City were at home, but in
Yep.
reality, all the other options just pale in comparison. And
The only two options below Holland in review are Rashford and Bruno, and
Odegaard.
given the and of course Odegaard, now that he has some penalty weightage assigned to him, and I think that given the tendency of Twitter populace to react to points that have been scored, I don't think Bruno and Rashford are going to be captain in any case. Forget about maybe there are a lot of United fans who just blindly captain United players, but other than that, I think everyone is going to be captaining Holland this week.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I do look forward to owning United midfielders, and I hope we get a
Yes.
slightly reduced ownership of them. But that's really it. You're just gonna captain Holland and hope the rest of your team does its job, which it didn't this
Yeah,
week. But hey,
yeah, we can hope for better, obviously, and that's it really for this week. Hope you guys have a good game week, and see you next week.